Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, well, that's another story. Now, imagine this. You're walking into a subway station in New York City, heading home after a long day. The platform is crowded, and you feel that familiar rush of city life around you. And suddenly, you hear a scream, and before you can react, someone is pushed onto the tracks just as a train barrels into the station. Panic erupts. The scene is chaotic, and your mind races with questions. What just happened? Was it an accident or something far worse? For 32-year-old Kendra Webdale, this was no accident. On January 3rd in 1999, she was tragically killed when Andrew Goldstein, a man with a long history of mental illness and violence, shoved her in front of an oncoming train. Goldstein, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, was well known to the system. Despite repeated hospitalizations and warnings about his unstable behavior, he was released back into the public just weeks before the fatal incident. This case sent shockwaves through New York City and the entire country, igniting debates about the failure of the mental health system. How could someone with such a clear history of violence be allowed to walk free? Who bears the responsibility for what happened to Kendra Webdale? The individual who committed the crime, or the institutions that let him slip through the cracks? Because of its nature, this case is hard to resolve. It left people at odds with one another, grappling with questions of justice, accountability, and systemic failure. And here we're going to dive deep into the story of Andrew Goldstein, a man whose freedom came at an unbearable cost, and explore whether justice was truly served. Stick with me, and by the end of this episode, you're going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Was this tragedy avoidable, or was it inevitable? Kendra Webdale's death was a devastating and senseless tragedy that sent shockwaves through the entire city and beyond. But what made this case so contentious was not just the act itself, but what led to it and what followed after. Andrew Goldstein, the man responsible, was no stranger to violence. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he had spent years cycling in and out of psychiatric hospitals. And time and again, he was deemed unstable and dangerous and in need of close supervision. Yet despite these warnings, he was released into the public without the support or oversight needed to manage his condition. And weeks later, Kendra crossed paths with him on that subway platform, and the result was a tragedy that might have been prevented if only the system had worked the way it should. The public's outrage grew as details of Goldstein's past came into light. In the weeks leading up to Kendra's death, he had begged for help multiple times. He was the one asking for help, telling hospital staff that he was afraid he might hurt someone. But with limited resources and overburdened mental health facilities, he was discharged again and again. And critics called it a catastrophic failure of the mental health system, one that had cost an innocent woman her life. Kendra's family, devastated by the loss, became outspoken advocates for change. Their efforts helped lead to the creation of Kendra's Law, a groundbreaking piece of legislation in New York that allows court-ordered treatment for individuals with severe mental illness. It was hailed as a victory by some, but others questioned whether it went far enough or whether it unfairly targeted individuals like Goldstein without addressing the root causes of systemic failures. The case didn't end with Goldstein's arrest. His trial became a focal point of media attention, further dividing public opinion. Was Andrew Goldstein solely to blame for what happened that day, or was he a symptom of a system that had long since collapsed under its own weight? And even if he was guilty? Did the system bear some responsibility for placing him in a situation where tragedy was almost inevitable? In this episode, we are going to get into the layers of this case, the facts, the arguments, and the lingering controversy to ask the tough questions. Was Kendra Webdale's death preventable? And more importantly, who should be held accountable? Andrew Goldstein's story began long before the tragic events on that subway platform. Diagnosed with schizophrenia in his late teens, Goldstein struggled with severe mental illness for most of his life. He frequently experienced delusions, paranoia, and violent outbursts, symptoms that were well documented during his repeated interactions with mental health professionals. Despite this, his journey through the system was marked by inconsistency, limited resources, and a lack of long-term support. In 1997, Goldstein committed his first violent crime. He assaulted a woman in a bookstore, an unprovoked attack that left her shaken but fortunately not seriously injured. This incident should have been a wake-up call to the authorities, but instead it became another missed opportunity. Goldstein was arrested and subjected to a psychiatric evaluation where he was once again diagnosed with schizophrenia and deemed a threat to others. He was institutionalized, but only temporarily. After receiving treatment, he was discharged, with little follow-up care left to navigate his illness on his own. For the next 2 years, and we're talking schizophrenia here, for the next 2 years, Goldstein's mental health deteriorated. He cycled in and out of hospitals, often checking himself involuntarily because he felt he was losing control. At one point, he reportedly begged for help, telling staff he feared he might hurt someone. But hospital resources were stretched thin and beds were in short supply. And like so many others, Goldstein was discharged after a brief stay deemed stabilized, but not cured. Each release sent him back into the world without the tools or support he needed to manage his illness effectively. And by late 1998, Goldstein's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Now he avoided treatment, stopped taking his meds, and withdrew from those around him. Yet despite clear signs that he was a danger to himself and others, not one person intervened. Not one. The system, overwhelmed and underfunded, let him fall through the cracks once again. And in December of that year, just weeks before the subway incident, Goldstein was released from his most recent hospital stay. And this time, the decision was made by medical professionals who believed he no longer posed an immediate threat. There was no court order for outpatient treatment, no mandated supervision. Just a vulnerable man with a history of violence left to fend for himself in a city of millions. Goldstein's release, it wasn't widely publicized at the time. To the public, he was just another nameless figure struggling with mental illness in a system that often failed to prioritize care. But for Kendra Webdale, his release would soon become a fatal oversight. On the morning of January 3rd in 1999, Kendra Webdale woke up like any other day, ready to take on the city she loved. She was a 32-year-old aspiring screenwriter. Kendra had moved to New York from upstate New York to chase her dreams. Known for her warmth and vibrant personality, she was the kind of person who seemed to light up the room anytime she entered. Her family described her as compassionate and full of life, someone who wanted to make a difference in the world. And that afternoon, she was heading to meet friends when she entered the 23rd Street subway station in Manhattan. The platform was crowded, as it often was during the hustle and bustle of the weekend. And Kendra, like many New Yorkers, had grown used to the chaos of subway travel, and she likely thought nothing of standing near the edge of the platform as she waited for her train. But among the sea of commuters that day was Andrew Goldstein, unmedicated, untreated, and spiraling deeper into his mental illness. Goldstein had been wandering the city aimlessly. Witnesses later described him as agitated and muttering to himself, showing signs of clear distress. He stood near Kendra, seemingly unnoticed, until the unthinkable happened. Without warning, Goldstein shoved Kendra from behind, sending her falling onto the tracks as a train barreled into the station. The impact was instant and fatal. The scene erupted into chaos. Bystanders screamed, some frozen in shock, while others frantically tried to signal the train operator to stop. But it was too late. Andrew Goldstein made no attempts to flee. Instead, he stood motionless as others rushed to help Kendra. When the police arrived, he reportedly confessed immediately, telling officers, "I did it. I don't know why, but I did it." His words only deepened the tragedy, revealing a man tormented by a mind he could no longer control. And the news of Kendra's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the city. For many, this was more than a tragic accident. This was a preventable crime. The public was outraged when details of Goldstein's past emerged. Here was a man with a documented history of violence and mental instability, and someone who begged for help but was repeatedly turned away by the system. How could such a clear danger have been allowed to walk free? Kendra's family was devastated. Her father, Ralph, became a vocal advocate for her reform, determined to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Kendra's death could have been prevented, he later said. She didn't have to die. The media descended on the story, turning it into a national debate. Headlines questioned the failures of the mental health system, while talk shows and op-eds dissected every aspect of the case. Was Goldstein solely to blame? Or was this a systemic failure? Could Kendra's death have been avoided? Or was it simply a tragic inevitability? The public's anger wasn't just directed at Goldstein. It extended to the institutions that had allowed him to slip through the cracks. Mental health advocates called for sweeping changes, while politicians used the case as a rallying cry for stricter oversight of psychiatric care. As for Andrew Goldstein, he was quickly charged with second-degree murder. But even as his trial loomed, the question remained, was he a cold-blooded killer or a deeply troubled man, failed by the very system meant to protect him and the public? And the fallout from Kendra Webdale's death was swift and widespread. Almost immediately, the public demanded answers. How could someone with Andrew Goldstein's history of violence and untreated mental illness have been allowed to roam free? The details of his prior hospitalizations and his repeated pleas for help only fueled this outrage. Goldstein's case became a symbol of a broken system, sparking protests, debates, and calls for reform. Mental health professionals were quick to point out the deeper issues at play. Decades of underfunding had left psychiatric institutions overwhelmed and ill-equipped to handle patients with severe mental illnesses like Goldstein's. Hospital beds were scarce, outpatient programs were stretched thin, and resources for long-term care were practically non-existent. Goldstein had been one of many who slipped through the cracks, a victim of a system that prioritized short-term stabilization over lasting support. But for Kendra's family and the general public, these explanations felt hollow. Many argued that Goldstein's release had been a reckless decision, one that ignored the very real danger he posed. How many more tragedies would it take before real change occurred? The media played a significant role in shaping the public's perception of the case. Headlines painted Goldstein as a ticking time bomb, while talk shows debated whether his crime was a failure of the mental health system or simply the act of a dangerous individual. Some outlets emphasized the tragedy of Kendra's death, while others delved into the broader implications of Goldstein's release, calling it a cautionary tale for cities across the country. In the wake of the tragedy, Kendra's family channeled their grief into action. Led by her father, Ralph Webdale, they worked tirelessly to advocate for changes to New York's mental health laws. Their efforts culminated in the passage of Kendra's Law in 1999, just months after her death. The legislation allowed courts to mandate outpatient treatment for individuals with severe mental illnesses, provided they meet specific criteria, such as a history of violence or repeated hospitalizations. And while Kendra's Law was hailed as a groundbreaking step forward, it wasn't without controversy. Critics argued that it infringed on the civil liberties of those with mental illnesses, forcing treatment upon them against their will. Others questioned whether the law went far enough to address the systemic issues that had led to Kendra's death. After all, mandating treatment was one thing, but ensuring that the resources and funding were there to support it, well, that was another matter entirely. For Andrew Goldstein, the passage of Kendra's Law came too late. His trial in 2000 brought the full weight of the public's anger down upon him. The defense argued that Goldstein's actions were the result of his untreated mental illness, not a calculated act of malice, and they pointed to his repeated cries for help, claiming that the system, not Goldstein, bore the ultimate responsibility for what happened on that subway platform. But then you have the prosecution. They argued that regardless of Goldstein's mental state, he had knowingly committed a violent crime and needed to be held accountable. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, convicting Goldstein of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring he would remain behind bars for the foreseeable future. But even with Goldstein's conviction, the public's outrage did not fade. For many, the case wasn't just about one man's crime. It was about the failure of an entire system to protect both Kendra and Goldstein himself. The debates surrounding Kendra's Law and the balance between public safety and the individual rights continue to this day, a testament to the enduring impact of her tragic death. And I really want to point this out because what makes this case so profoundly tragic is that Andrew Goldstein, despite his mental illness, actively sought help to prevent exactly what happened on that subway platform. He recognized his own violent impulses, and he understood the danger he himself posed, and he took it upon himself to turn to the hospitals and the professionals begging for intervention. He didn't want to harm anyone, and he told hospital staff this very thing on multiple occasions. But the system, overburdened and underfunded, consistently turned him away, discharging him with no meaningful support, no treatment plan. So in many ways, the crime was not just a failure of Goldstein's control over his own illness, which by default is a lack of control, but a glaring failure of the system that ignored his warnings, that turned him away. Essentially, Goldstein did not want to commit a crime, and he wanted to be stopped before it would happen. And yet, by failing to provide him the care he so desperately sought, the system practically set the stage for the tragedy that followed, and then it is the system that put him away for 25 years to life. In the aftermath of Kendra Webdale's death, well, that sparked a firestorm of public outrage, unlike anything the city had seen in recent memory. The news of Andrew Goldstein's release and the details of his long troubled history triggered intense scrutiny of New York's mental health care system. For many, this case symbolized a critical failure. A man who had openly acknowledged his violent tendencies was left to spiral out of control with devastating consequences. But this was more than a policy failure. It was a moral reckoning. Who bore the ultimate responsibility for Kendra's death? The media latched onto this story, framing Goldstein as a dangerous man who had been unleashed upon an unsuspecting public. Yet as the facts emerged, the focus shifted to the institutions that had repeatedly let him down. Headlines asked why psychiatric hospitals had ignored Goldstein's own warnings, why outpatient care was so underfunded, and why no one had intervened in time. Public opinion, it was sharply divided. While some viewed Goldstein as irredeemable, others saw him as the tragic byproduct of a broken system. And for Kendra's family, the pain was unimaginable. Her father, Ralph, he refused to let her death be in vain. Working with lawmakers and mental health advocates, he spearheaded the push for Kendra's Law, a piece of legislation designed to prevent tragedies like this. The law allowed courts to mandate outpatient treatment for individuals with severe mental illnesses who were deemed a danger to themselves or to others. It was hailed as a necessary step forward, but not without controversy, because of that argument that it infringed on individual rights and unfairly targeted the mentally ill. No-win situation. Now, despite these debates, Kendra's Law became a permanent fixture in New York's approach to mental health care. It was a victory for reform advocates, but it was a painful reminder of the cost of inaction. For Goldstein, the changes came too late. By the time the legislation passed, he was already serving 25 years to life for Kendra's murder, a sentence that many viewed as both just and tragic. After all, how do you punish a man who tried to stop himself from becoming a criminal, only to be ignored until it's too late and then put away forever? This case is an uncomfortable one, and it raises an enduring question. How many more lives would be lost before the system was truly fixed? And so it was. Kendra's death became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about how society handles individuals with severe mental illnesses. For many, the tragedy exposed deep flaws in how the system balanced compassion for the mentally ill with the need to protect the public. At the heart of the controversy was the question, could this have been prevented? And if so, who was truly to blame? The public's reaction was swift and polarizing. For some, Goldstein was irredeemable, a man whose actions were unforgivable, and they didn't care about the mental state. They called for harsher penalties and questioned whether the justice system had gone soft by allowing people like Goldstein back into society. Others took a more nuanced view, focusing on how systemic failures, not just Goldstein's illness, had contributed to the tragedy. These voices argued that the case was less about personal guilt and more about a broken system unable to handle its most vulnerable patients. And politicians, well, they wasted no time seizing on the outrage. Local and state leaders promised sweeping reforms to prevent another tragedy like Kendra's. But even as they introduced legislation and allocated funds for mental health programs, critics questioned whether these efforts were enough or if they were simply political theater meant to placate the public until the next crisis. Kendra's Law, while groundbreaking, was not without its limitations. While it allowed courts to mandate treatment, it still relied on a system that was underfunded and overwhelmed. The media played a significant role in shaping the narrative. Sensational headlines focused on Goldstein's history of violence and his seemingly random attack on an innocent woman. Talk shows and opinion columns turned Kendra's death into a nationwide debate about mental health and public safety and institutional accountability. But as the story grew, so did the risk of oversimplification. Goldstein became a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And while the nuances of his struggles and the failures that led to Kendra's death were often lost in the noise, the case also left mental health advocates grappling with tough questions. How do you really balance the rights of individuals with severe mental illnesses against the need to protect society? How do you ensure that people like Goldstein get the care they need before it is too late? And perhaps most critically, why does it take a tragedy like Kendra's death to spur meaningful action? Why can't we see this could be a problem before it even happens? For the Webdale family, these questions were deeply personal. Kendra's father and siblings became tireless advocates for change. They spoke out at public forums and worked closely with lawmakers. They wanted Kendra's story to be a catalyst for reform and not just another headline. Their efforts were instrumental in passing Kendra's law, but they also came with a heavy burden. As Ralph Webdale later said, no family should have to endure this kind of loss just to see the system take action. Even with the reforms, the case remains a painful reminder of how far we still have to go. Goldstein's tragic trajectory, seeking help, being ignored, and ultimately committing a crime, the crime he feared he might commit, highlights the complexity of these issues. Was justice served by sentencing him to 25 to life? Or was it merely a way to close the chapter on an uncomfortable story? The public may never agree, but one thing is clear. The system that failed both Andrew Goldstein and Kendra Webdale continues to fail countless others to this day. Andrew Goldstein's case, it's more than just a tragedy. This case is a haunting reminder of how the cracks in our systems can have devastating consequences. Kendra Webdale's death wasn't just the result of one man's actions. This was a culmination of systemic failures that allowed a preventable tragedy to unfold. The mental health system, overburdened and underfunded, repeatedly missed opportunities to intervene. Goldstein's history of seeking help and warning others about his own violent impulses makes this case particularly difficult to reconcile. For Kendra's family, the pain and loss never truly faded, but their advocacy turned that grief into meaningful change. Kendra's law became a landmark piece of legislation providing a framework for court-ordered outpatient treatment for individuals with severe mental illnesses. The law was celebrated by many as a necessary step forward, but it also raises complex ethical questions about balancing public safety with individual rights. As for Goldstein, he remains a polarizing figure in the public eye. Some view him solely as a murderer, while others see him as a tragic example of what happens when society fails to prioritize mental health care. His life sentence ensures he will never walk free again, but it also raises a very uncomfortable question about justice. Was it truly served here, or did the system fail both Kendra and Goldstein, creating a situation where this crime became inevitable? The legacy of this case extends far beyond the courtroom. It forced a nationwide reckoning with how we treat mental illness, public safety, and how that's managed, and allocate resources for those in need. Yet even with Kendra's law in place, the debate rages on. Have we done enough to prevent another tragedy like this? Or are we still allowing individuals to fall through the cracks? What if one of them came upon you? For those of us looking back on this case, the questions linger. How many more lives need to be lost before meaningful change takes root? What should justice look like in cases where systemic failure plays such a significant role? And perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that the memory of people like Kendra Webdale leads to a safer and more compassionate world? Something to think about. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Ask the difficult questions, and always dig for the truth. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.